Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Power Driven Podcast. Today, we're talking about smoke, all things smoke. We're going to answer the gas air tuners. Why are diesel people so stupid?
So a lot of people have asked us, why do diesel smoke? A lot of you guys have wondered, why do diesel smoke? Think about those old, Smokey and the Bandit, or those old videos from the 70s and 80s. Those big semi-trucks were always rolling coal everywhere.
Yeah.
So why do diesel smoke? You ever see a locomotive? Maybe not today, but 20 years ago, back when I was younger, the locomotives, they were always rolling coal. You ever seen a ship, even a cruise ship? Mm-hmm. I've seen some coal coming out of modern cruise ships.
Yeah, different emission standards.
So why do diesel smoke?
Yeah. This is kind of your specialty. You've been excited about this. So diesel smoke, I mean, the obvious answer is because even at stoic, when you have a perfect combustion, every oxygen molecule is absorbed with the perfect amount of fuel. It still smokes. Even a diesel at stoichiometric ratio, perfect, still smokes. So the fuel itself is smoky inherently.
So stoichiometric ratio is when you have the perfect amount of fuel and oxygen molecules to combine to burn. So stoic on a gas, like true gasoline's like 14.7, but your regular pump gas right now, it's like E10 or 10% ethanol. It's about 14.1. A diesel stoic or perfect air fuel ratio to get complete combustion is about it's like 14.47, but everybody calls it 14.5. And diesel, there's number 2, there's number 1, there's bio blend. So we'll just call it 14.5 for easy numbers. Right. So that's the perfect ratio. However, even on a gasoline engine,
that's like your air fuel ratio, right? If you had an AFR gauge in your exhaust, you have 14.5 parts oxygen and 1 part fuel.
Correct.
Which that'll throw a lot of people for a loop. It's by weight, in case you're curious. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
So 14.5 to 1 is stoic for a diesel. So first thing I did getting ready for this podcast.
Oh dear.
If you go and you search what is the perfect. All right. First we got about Lambda values.
Okay.
Lambda is a ratio of stoic. So a lambda of 1 is 14.5 parts air and 1 part diesel.
For diesel.
Mm-hmm. For gasoline, if it's pure gasoline, it's 14.7. If it's E10, regular pump gas, 14.1. If it's methanol, it's down in the 6s. Nitromethane is down in the 3s. It's like 3 parts air to 1 part fuel.
Yeah. So basically, 1 is the perfect blend, the ideal blend,
for that
regardless of what the fuel is.
Now, all the OEMs, all the professional tuning software, they all work off of Lambda values. Why? Because Lambda doesn't care what blend of alcohol or whatever is mixed into the fuel. A lambda of 1 means they're equal amount, a perfect ratio of air to fuel. And they determine that by how much oxygen is left coming out the tailpipe. So there's no oxygen really coming out. They know they're at a lambda of 1. Man,
isn't it true? Like when you have an AFR gauge, you have to calibrate it to what fuel type you're using, but you're basically calibrating from a lambda to your.
So the AFR gauges I have had, you don't have to calibrate them to the fuel type. Okay. It's just purely, it does an open air test off of your background and oxygen.
So it knows you the 14.5 to 1, or is it giving you lambda?
It gives it's all in lambda. So if you're calibrating the gauge, you have to tell it the fuel if you want it to tell you AFR. But if you want it in lambda, they all read lambda. They calculate AFR.
That's what I was trying to say, is that the gauge inherently measures lambda. Like when on our dyno, we had to calibrate it to tell it that we run diesel, and then we realized we're dumb. Like, hey, just read everything in lambda. That way, every fuel type is just going to work. We can talk to other tuners. It doesn't matter. We're all using the same.
So like if I have our gauge and our dyno hooked up, and I run diesel, it'll know it's 14.5 to 1. And then if I get that off and strap on a top fueler, it'll know that lambda is 3 to 1. It'll just know that.
It will measure lambda, but it will tell you if you have AFR shown on the screen, it will show the wrong AFR ratio if you put a different fuel in there.
It doesn't know what kind of fuel you have. It just knows how much oxygen's left. And if it's perfect, then theoretically you have no oxygen, no nothing else. And so it just knows, okay, we don't know what fuel type this is, but there's no oxygen left.
So there's no oxygen left, and we know there's 3 parts of fuel. I mean, there's no oxygen. That's a 1. That's that. There's no oxygen. As soon as you get to 1, if there's oxygen left, then we're at a 80% of lambda.
Yeah.
Oh no, 120% of lambda. If there's no oxygen, how does it know when it's beyond no oxygen.
And it's not really that there's no oxygen. There is a small amount left. And so it's calibrating off that, 0.1% of oxygen left.
Mhm.
That's how it knows how rich you are, how much of that tiny bit of background oxygen that should still not combust on a normal engine.
Hmm.
Because there's nitrogen and stuff in there that kind of blocks all the oxygen. But in short, Lambda is what everything is based off of. So now that we've taught you a little bit about what Lambda is.
So just quickly, how do you, to be rich in Lambda is what, like 80% is rich? And
Yeah, anything
120
less than a 1 is rich.
More
Anything greater is leaner.
Okay.
And it's a simple percentage. If you are 0.9 Lambda or 90%, you are 10% rich on fuel. If you're 0.8 Lambda, you're 20% rich.
Okay.
If you're 1.2 Lambda, you're 20% lean,
Got you.
meaning there's extra oxygen. So back to AI overview, diesel Lambda values.
Oh,
Diesels typically fall in a range of 1.1 to 1.65 Lambda, indicating lean air-fuel mixtures. It says the ideal Lambda for maximum efficiency and lowest fuel consumption is around 1.65 Lambda. Well, guess what? If you put that in AFR, that's 24 to 1.
Wow.
24 to 1.
So that's what they're saying ideal for clean, efficient combustion. All right.
Man.
You can't even run a gasoline engine at 24 to 1. It won't even stay running.
Because it's too lean, not a fuel.
Too lean. It can't even go there.
Can ignite.
I have an AFR gauge on a few of my vehicles that are gas, and the leanest they'll stay running before the engine shuts off is about 22 to 1. And you can't make any power there. It'll ping and detonate and knock. So when you're cruising at light throttle on a gas engine, they're running right at stoic or about 14.7 or let's say Lambda of 1. If you run a diesel at Lambda of 1, it's smoking out the tailpipe.
Right.
If you run a gas at Lambda of 1, under heavy load, it's pinging and detonating, and the manufacturer's tune will put more fuel than that in there.
So you'll go to the like 90% or 80.
90, 80, right in that range. So the number one reason, I remember when Mike Finnegan asked us when we were working on Blasphemy, he's like, dude, tell me.
Why this?
Level with me. Why do diesel smoke? And I said, it's all about power.
Yeah.
And Mike's like, well, smoke means that it's tuned poorly. It doesn't make max power where it's tuned poorly.
Well, depends on the fuel you're running, I suppose. And so, like, your gas tuners will see that. What do they, I mean, like, okay, so now let's talk a little bit power. You want to make some good power. What Lambda do you need to be in a gasoline application to, make good power and not melt stuff down?
So generally, a lot of gas guys, they speak AFR. So we'll just talk AFR and gas because I'd have to convert the Lambda. Depends on your fuel type. But like on gasoline, they're usually about 12.5 to 13 to 1 naturally aspirated.
Oh, wow.
So what's 12.5 divided by
14.5?
Divided by 14.7.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So that's 0.85 Lambda. So 0.85 Lambda is where most naturally aspirated gas cars make, max power.
What about like turbo cars?
So when the turbo, because they need extra cooling, because if they get a hot cylinder or some hot spots, it'll start pinging and detonating. For reliability, they go richer than that. They're more like 0.8 Lambda, 11.7, 12 to 1. So my EcoBoost right now, I checked it, it's richer than, it's running down the road at richer than 0.85 Lambda.
Oh, wow.
When we were dyno testing diesels last time, Meyer, we kept adding fuel in the junker drag truck. What Lambda value did it make the maximum power?
It makes peak power right about 0.8.
0.8.
0.85, like right there is peak power. You go richer than that and it starts losing power.
So diesel makes peak power at the same Lambda as a gasoline engine.
Mm-hmm.
But my EcoBoost, when I'm at 0.85 or 0.8 Lambda, I don't see any visible smoke coming out of the tailpipe. What does the junker drag truck look like at 0.8 or 0.85 Lambda?
It's fogging some things out.
You can't see through it at all.
Yeah, no,
It's going to fail the opacity test at your old emissions tester center.
yes.
So if you tune a diesel to peak power, it will not pass an opacity test in any state in the country. It's dirty.
Is there a difference though in the different technologies of diesel, like versus like you're talking about the junker, which is P pump, low injection pressure, big fat injectors, large globules of fuel, we'll say, versus like a common oil. Common oil do they also make the same peak power? Have you done much in your common rail on
I
AFR?
have never put a AFR sensor on any of my common rails, so I actually don't know. I would assume it's probably right there around the same. I think they are able to maintain cleanliness longer is their main thing, just because the burn, when it's able to utilize all the oxygen in the cylinder better.
Yeah, because
I think a common rail at one Lambda, I think it's pretty clean. Like 12 valve is not. 12 valve is not super clean at one.
Yeah.
So I mean, we haven't done a ton of common rail testing, but if you get into like publications and literature, I don't know how much is on common rail technology if we're talking mechanical, but generally they say the smoke threshold is between 20 and 22 to 1. That 20 and 22 to 1, you're talking 1.38 to like 1.4 lambda.
That's what you got to be.
That's where you start. That's how lean you have to be till there's no smoke.
And I know like the nitrous guys, like, I mean, and when you're making big power, I don't even know if you could get there with turbos alone. I mean, I guess you can in the common rail, but like, I'm thinking like
3. I mean, yeah, you definitely could. I mean, 12 valves will get there if you pull a bunch of fuel out. Like yours, I don't remember what setup we had.
If you pull fuel out, I'm thinking, okay, in all my testing, like on a 12 valve, or let's just say P pump, because it's a 24 valve P pump.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I could get it that lean and make anywhere near the power it makes now.
Oh,
I mean,
for sure.
I mean, it'd be like hundreds of horsepower.
Oh yeah, like 2/3 at most.
Yeah.
Probably
So like without nitrous in a mechanical truck, there's no way to run clean down the track because you're just going to be giving up way too much power on a mechanical truck.
Mm-hmm.
I've made 1,500 horsepower on my common rail daily. You're close to 1,800 in yours in Scrat. And is that pretty clean at 1,800?
It's not squeaky, but it's not bad.
Yeah.
It's pretty clean. I mean, I'd say the peak, big tune, like 1850 or whatever it does. I mean, it's plenty of fuel, like using all the air in the cylinder. If I turn that down to 1750, it's pretty darn clean.
Wow. So the fuel makes a big difference. Obviously, like, so all the gasser tuners out there who think diesels are morons, like literally we're tuning to the same ratios they are. Like it's just you tune to where the fuel makes power and that's it. And so it's not that diesel guys don't know how to tune. They just like anybody else. They want the most power they can get. And if you're going to do that, you're probably going to have a little bit of smoke out of a diesel. Unless you go crazy lean, because you said diesels pick up power. Like
Yeah,
you
so
said, it loses power at lean, but the diesels don't, right?
Yeah, the diesels keep going, and the gas will get to where it won't make power anymore. They'll lose if they go lean. But like on a diesel, like some of these top race cars, they're at a 2.0 Lambda. We're talking 30 to 1 air fuel ratio.
Wow.
They don't pick up. So let's say they put in a 500 shot of nitrous when they're at stoic or at Lambda of 1. If they put in 500 shot of nitrous and pick up 500 horsepower, the Lambda might go, depends how big the engine is, but let's say it goes from a 1 to a 1.5.
Mm-hmm.
If they put another 500 shot in, it won't go from 1.5. It'll go to like 1.75, and they only pick up like 200 horsepower instead of 500. And then that last, getting really lean, there's very little gains. Essentially, they're burning pounds and pounds of nitrous or tons of oxygen-rich stuff to get it that lean, where they're not getting the benefit, but it cools off.
So they do that for combustion temperature control. So there's two ways that diesel guys control combustion temperature on wildly powerful things. In the past, in the sled pull world, you'll see those guys put out more smoke than you've ever seen. They're using excess fuel to absorb the heat and cool the combustion. And the modern drag racer guys on common rails are using nitrous to, just put so much dang air in there.
And that's because like your sled pull guys, they have their air limited setups. Their class rules are they have this size of turbo. There's a lot of rules on how much air they can put in that thing with like just stringencies on the turbos they can run. And so if they can't just run it perfect because it'll overheat, so they have to they're forced. They're not going to make it lean. They're going to lose half their power.
Right.
They have to just throw a bunch of fuel at it to cool it off that way. Drag racers don't have that limitation.
Right.
They can do basically whatever they want as long as there's some rules that are met. And so you can run lean. It's more reliable that way. And I think that with nitrous, you can also pull out a bunch of timing, and that helps keep the whole bottom end happy as well. You're not making a bunch of peak cylinder pressure because you're able to drop that down. The nitrous accelerates it.
Why? Yeah. Why do you think you can pull timing? I know why, but tell people why you can pull timing with nitrous.
Nitrous is an accelerant. It helps speed up the burn process. And then especially when you are that lean, it's able to just burn really fast. That means you can put the fuel in later, it'll burn faster. And so you don't have that initial hit of burn so early in the cylinder where it's going to make a lot of cylinder pressure.
Yeah, and that also goes kind of along with your mechanical technology. The common rail technology is it happens faster in common rail because every drop of fuel is way finer in common rail.
You're just making so much more pressure. I mean,
the holes are way smaller too. More pressure, smaller holes. Obviously, it's way more atomized.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, my injectors. I want to say my injectors are the equivalent to like a 5x16. They are close to that.
Yeah,
and yours are. I mean, yours are 5 by.
Those are 6x30.
6x30. Yeah, so a couple different league there for sure.
Yeah.
I had some thought. We were talking about injection timing and stuff. And I lost it. So continue.
So getting back to why diesel smoke. So this goes right in hand with factory. You take a factory calibration. Why can you add 100 horsepower by putting a tune on a factory truck? Maybe even 200 horse on some applications, but 100 horsepower, pretty much all the brands, you can add 100 with tuning.
Yeah.
Well, if they're running, according to AI, at a 1.65 or 1.1 Lambda, if you add fuel, you don't have to do anything to the turbo.
Nope.
No more air. It will make more power. On my personal race truck, on fuel, when it's making around 1,200 horsepower and it's about a 0.9 Lambda, if I get more air into the cylinder and get it to like a 105 Lambda, so we're basically making it 10% leaner, I pick up 200 horsepower on my 1,200 horsepower truck.
Yeah.
So now that's getting more air in there. If I am on the other end, let's say I'm way lean, but I've like wastegated the air back to where, let's say I am, 1.1 Lambda on there, and we add fuel, we can pick up hundreds of horsepower on a 1,000-ish horsepower. So we're talking 10, 20% very easily. Well, if you take a factory truck that's making 400 horsepower, 10% of that's 40, 20% is 80. You can, there's a lot of power to be had there.
Which is why diesel became so dang popular, because it was so easy to add power to them. They had that explosion in the late 90s, early 2000s, because you get a good running truck and all of a sudden you're adding 100 horsepower, 200 horsepower, and all of a sudden you're keeping up with Corvettes and Camaros pretty easily because they had that turbo system. And so it was addictive, and it's awesome. The power you can make with them is so easy.
Now there's more than just the richening though, right?
Right.
Oh,
because I know you're squirming over there because the boost is going to go up when you put more fuel in there as well.
For sure. You put more fuel in. Whether you're changing those settings on the wastegate or not, you put more fuel in there, you're going to make more boost, and that will be even more air to be able to burn even more fuel.
Yeah.
And then you start doing things like increasing timing. Party time.
Let's talk a little bit about, so we know the fuel's different. What about the combustion process itself? I know like you talk a lot about in cylinder heads, you do a lot of cylinder development. You talk about swirl and the mixing of the air. Like, what is that all about? How does that aid in haze and smoke? And what are the tricks you can do? Like, okay, now that I have my truck here, how do I make it smoke less?
So there's a little difference in the way like gasoline and diesel burn in an engine. Gasoline, methanol, E85, all of these basically non-diesel things, they mix the fuel with the air before it gets all swirled and it gets a homogeneous mix of air and fuel. It gets compressed up, and then a spark plug starts it. And there's a little flame kernel that starts there, and it burns outward from the spark plug, assuming everything's working right and you're not detonating or something weird, and it burns out through the cylinder. On a diesel, there's no fuel in there. The air is in there, the piston comes up and compresses it, and then it starts injecting fuel into this air mix. So you don't have a homogeneous mix. You have a very rich, fuel-rich environment, and it's kind of more like a candle flame where it's burning out from, and like a candle flame is the same thing. It has like liquid wax. It's coming up the wick. The heat from that's kind of burning and turning into a vapor. Well, wet diesel doesn't burn. It has to kind of turn into a vapor first. And so it has to mix with that hot air in the cylinder. And so that mixing action on a gas engine happens early on through a carburetor, a fuel injector, the whole intake track. A diesel, all that mixing has to happen basically at top dead center in that piston bowl.
Yeah, for sure.
And so the way we're mixing that is if you get that whole air charge swirling hard before, and then that piston comes up and squeezes that all into the bowl, well, that air had a lot of momentum spinning. It's still swirling and spinning in that piston bowl. And as that fuel comes out of the injectors, now it's hitting a swirling air mass and it mixes better as it's coming out. And that's how you get it to kind of burn more cleanly. If you've ever had like a campfire and it's wet and it's kind of smothering and not, that's kind of like how diesel, if you don't have good swirl.
I was gonna say, like, if you had like a bowl of water and you take a little bit of red food coloring and you drop it in the middle of it, that red water is just gonna sit there. Whereas if you sit there and you swirl that bucket of water up and then you drip that fuel coloring in there, give it a little bit of time, it'll be fully mixed. And that's like what we're doing. Gas, it's mixed in with the air, basically as good as it can be. And then the charge goes off. Diesels, we are expecting that fuel charge to somehow mix with the air well before it actually lights off, which is all happening so quickly. I mean, that's a lot that in tuning side as well. I mean, you're talking about head swirl. That's huge. I mean, we've seen lots of like cleanliness gains and just like peppiness of the truck gains just with getting that fuel charge mixed in, because it's easy to say, oh, AFR, like you have this much air and this much fuel. And so on paper, that should make a good running mixture. If your fuel is only mixing in with half of the air in the cylinder, you have a 3 liter. Like, cool. Like you really lost out you're not utilizing the capability of burning the other half of that air. So that swirl makes a big difference. Also, the tuning side of it, like the injector choice, there's a couple different things that can really play into how well that fuel is burning in the cylinder before it gets charged off.
So someone might be thinking to themselves, if they're not like intimately familiar with the diesel engine, well, why don't they just inject diesel like a gas in the ports early so it can be homogenized before it comes in? Why do you have to wait to inject the diesel to the very end of the piston stroke? Why can't it come in with the air?
So part of that is diesel, like the auto ignition temperature and all that on it. It needs a lot of compression and heat to start burning. And so if you put it in, so basically the engine is built with a lot of compression and makes a lot of heat. You get boosts and stuff in there. If you put that in beforehand, assuming it could stay vaporized and there, it would unpredictably light off before you're ready.
Yeah, we're complaining about 40 degrees of timing running like crap. Imagine 180 degrees of timing. Like it wouldn't run well.
And as the engine gains speed and temperature, it might go off at the wrong time. Like they need to put the fuel in at the right time.
And that's how you time it. Yeah. If you want an earlier burn, you inject the fuel earlier. If you put it in with the valve, like say, even if it were able to stay entrapped in the air and not land on cylinder walls, because gas, when you pour a little bit of gas on the ground, it's going to vaporize. Diesel, it'll sit there and soak into the concrete.
Yep.
That's what you get.
Yeah. One of the advantages of diesel engines, people probably know, is they get better fuel economy than a gasoline engine. One of the reasons is it's a denser fuel, true, but another reason is because we can build engines with ridiculous compression ratios. Like what's your 1200 horsepower race truck compression ratio? Do you know?
I mean, it's like 17.5-1 right now.
Crazy. Like a gasoline guy's like, wait, what? You have a 1200 horsepower, 100 pounds of boost and 17-1 compression? That's that doesn't compute.
Yeah.
And so but you need
fact,
that heat.
Actually, my new engine it's like 18-1 actually. I mean, we're up there.
We've built a couple in the 20 to 22 range and they run great.
Yeah, compression is your friend in everything. And so but in order to have a diesel do that, you cannot have the fuel in before you do it, because like you say, it'll light too early. You'll have all kinds of problems. You'll have blown up blocks and all kinds of crazy stuff. So in order to get that efficiency, we had to give up the fuel mixing in the port, which also limits the amount of fuel you can put in, because we have a much smaller window in which we can inject the fuel compared to a gasoline that can just inject the fuel 100% of the time. And so there's a couple drawbacks, but luckily we've kind of figured out ways to make power anyway.
Yeah, because you're talking like on a gas engine, they have a port fuel injector and it can just stay on and just spray.
Yeah, the whole time.
Where, I mean, I don't think they do that at idle, obviously. No, and they time it when they can, because it does help a little bit if they time it right, so it doesn't just pool in there. They want it to go when the actual intake valve is moving air through there. But at the same time, they can go the whole time. A diesel, you just have, a few degrees before top dead center, a couple degrees after.
If you're like a no boy and stretch out your injectors way too long, which means you inject with those injectors way too long, way longer than you really should, and you'll hurt them eventually, that's 0.003 of a second. Cool.
Yeah.
That's not a lot.
Yeah, you got a lot more in a gasoline application.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the cooling effect of fuel. Now I want to start with some gas or trash because it's a little bit relevant here.
All right.
So a lot of guys, they talk about factory race fuel. Now, as a diesel guy, we've had factory race fuel at the pump our whole life.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they've sold number 2 diesel before I was even born.
Yep.
So factory race fuel's there. But a gas guys, when they came out with this E85, these guys were just like in love with this E85 factory race fuel. One of the reasons E85 makes more power and it doesn't detonate or they can run more boost with it is it does take more of that fuel to hit stoich. And then when you run that rich, that means 20% rich. Let's say instead of there being 1 cup of extra fuel in the cylinder, there's 1.5 cups of extra fuel if you have a fuel that requires more. And so that gives you more cooling effect. The more fuel you have to burn, the more cooling you have. You take that a step further, a methanol engine, they can run ridiculous boost, ridiculous timing because they have so much cooling from all that extra fuel. So you're getting the same thing in these diesel trucks. When you get in these, we were talking about class limited sled pulling. Some of these trucks where people see these traditional, we're talking coal train, choo-choo train, like wet smoke dang near coming out of the stack. That is a sled pull truck that is, per the rules, they weren't allowed to use water injection or anything. And so the only way to cool off, to keep from melting stuff, they have to put extra fuel in there. So much that they start losing power. In fact, they're flirting with how much extra fuel do I put in to keep the engine alive and versus how much power am I losing? Because in that situation, they are actually losing power by taking fuel away. However, if you can't make it through the event, then it doesn't matter if you make the most horsepower and you can't even live one event.
Track,
or you have to rebuild your engine every event. So they kind of flirt with how rich they run it based on how much traction the track has and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of one thing I would say that gives diesels a little bit of a bad thing in the smoke is these people see this at the fairgrounds or whatever, this heavy smoke. I would argue the exact same is true when like a locomotive in the 70s and 80s was pulling up a grade and it was just rolling coal. That was a reliability thing. When they had to be ran wide open for an hour, pulling, 1 million tons up the grade, there's a lot of load on those diesel engines in there. Now they're just turning generators, but they still have to generate that electricity to push the train. And so part of that smoke is to get that cooling effect from the fuel. The exact same thing on a gas engine. They don't run around at stoich or lambda of 1. They run rich so that they have reliability. That is not the best fuel economy. If an automotive manufacturer is trying to get the maximum fuel economy, they will run right at stoich or actually a little bit lean. Some of the new LS engines I've seen, they'll run like 16.5 to 1 at really light throttle because they get just a little more fuel economy out of every drop of fuel if they can run it slightly lean. But they can't go much more than about 16.5 to 1, and that's only at like 10% throttle, very light load cruising. When they get any kind of load, they go right to stoich, and once they go over about 70% throttle or 70% load, they go right. They have to enrich it for the reliability.
So you're talking about like this smoke coming out, and they're making it rich to cool the combustion, and gasoline engines do the same thing. So you got a mixed turbo or sled pull class. Engine can be gas or diesel, but you're turbo limited. The same turbo, so they're both moving through, let's say 150 pounds of air a minute, okay? And they're both running at like 80% lambda. They're both, or maybe 75. So they're on the rich side so that they can keep the engine alive.
So peak horsepower, but just rich enough to
keep it alive. On the gas engine, that engine would run visibly clean.
Yeah, you wouldn't see it at 0.8
on the
lambda.
Diesel engine, it would run visibly. You could see this smoke.
Be very heavy at 0.8 lambda.
When that happens, you get a lot of people on YouTube saying, "Oh, that's great for the earth. This smoke, guys. You guys do this like you're killing Mother Earth or something like that." Like, so in your opinion, because you can see the smoke, is it actually worse than smoke you can't see?
So in the studies, they've shown the smoke you can see, most of it falls back to Mother Earth and kind of gets incorporated in the soil. Is actually quite harmless.
Fertilizer almost.
So the stuff you can't see is the bad stuff that gets in your lungs and causes, smog.
Yeah.
And that's directly proportional to the amount of fuel you burn. So that guy, if he's running methanol, he's at like 6 to 1 AFR.
So way more pounds of fuel.
He's burning twice as much fuel as the diesel guy is going down the track. So he's technically polluting more. You just can't see it.
So he's hurting Mother Earth more than the diesel. Diesels are really good for the earth. I've always known that. But yeah, people see, like, since you can see the smoke, oh, you guys are polluting like crazy. This guy over here who's actually doing way worse from a polluting standpoint, since you can't see it, it's not a problem. As long as you can't see it, it's not really there. Okay, got it. You've been playing a lot with different thoughts. Like Meyer is our smoke-free champion.
I'm not gonna say smoke-free champion, but it's been a goal for a long time. Like I love power on the street as long as I can make it clean. Like a lot of people will love big injectors because big injectors make big power. I want to run like the smallest injector that I can to make the power I'm trying to make, because that generally is the most clean running truck on the street. Because if it smokes every time you get into it, then I can't get into it whenever I want. I have to wait to that back road and be respectful of everyone and not smoke anyone out. If it's clean like all the time, I can get into it all the time. And that makes it just way more fun for me. So, but yeah, I do try pretty hard to make my stuff run fairly clean.
So the smaller injectors give you a little bit better atomization.
Better atomization.
Same amount of fuel pressure, smaller hole size. It's
Yep.
going to give you that. That's kind of what we saw with our power jets on the mechanical side. We put a couple really small pilot holes in there. And I mean,
Just
why
gets the burn.
do you think that's just because it gets a burn started faster? Like, why does that? I mean, that kills smoke like crazy.
I think it's hard to know what's happening in the cylinder, but I think something that an issue we run into is, first of all, the swirling. We have to make sure that air is mixing in with the fuel is mixing in with that air, and you're getting even fuel mixture before that burn goes off. Like say, if you have half the air that doesn't even have fuel in it, it's going to end up not burning, and you'll end up, even if you're barely making any power and on paper you're running 24-1 into where you should be really lean, it will still sit there and smoke going down the road, or cold in the morning, whatever it is, it'll sit there and smoke. And that's generally because you don't have a good mixture. The other part I think that we run into is that fuel hitting the bowl. And so if you just throw a big, like whether you got really big injectors or very low pressure or whatever it is, and you are hitting the bowl with that spray jet, you're
hitting the actual piston bowl.
Hitting the piston bowl itself. That's going to sit there. It's going to burn on the piston for the next however many degrees. And that's going to not make power, and it's just going to sit there and smoke. And so that's one thing that small injector helps. It helps that automation happen. But like we've seen it on like some like
the air in the cylinder is hot. The piston is relatively cool compared to that air charge, and the fuel's not going to burn when it hits the relatively cool piston.
It'll slow it down a lot for sure.
Just sidebar here. Sorry, just thinking about it. We haven't done this test, but I do wonder, talking about nitrous and how it's an accelerant and it oxidizes. I do wonder if at the same Lambda with nitrous versus turbo, if the nitrous would be cleaner. Just because it wouldn't have time to hit the bowl. It would just accelerate the burn so
make
fast.
it burn fast. I'd be curious to see that.
Yeah.
I don't know how you would do the
because Lambda, you're reading the exhaust coming out, and so there's a lot of time for stuff to burn in the exhaust track before you get to your your Lambda gauge, where it would be hard to know, but it'd be interesting.
Yeah. Does the oxidations kind of like almost prove your point? If it burns fast enough that it doesn't actually hit the bowl, it's the same amount of air molecules in the cylinder. It's hard because it might be colder because of nitrous. It's tough. It's a really tough one to say apples to apples. That'd be a pretty tough one to do.
In a lot of the research I've done on compression, ignition, combustion in general, like the study, all these PhD guys on that, is it doesn't kind of burn through from one end to the other like a gas engine that starts at the spark. It burns more on the edges where it's the right air fuel ratio, and there's not so much diesel that it's cooling off the air charge, because it's got to get hot enough to get an auto ignition temperature, and it's got to mix with oxygen all in one. And that doesn't, in the center of all those fuel jets that come out from the nozzle, it doesn't burn right there. It's too rich and too cold. And so it's really just, it's almost like the outside of each of those fuel jets goes. The reason I think the power jets burn cleaner is because those little jets are so small, they don't have a dense thing. They start building just heat in the cylinder in general. And those two power jets start basically a flame front that's burning through those other diesel charges.
And that's what I was going to say too, is like another thing that comes into effect with smoke output is your pilot shot. In a common rail, you're putting a small pilot shot in a cylinder to where it heats up the cylinder. Now, there's multiple factors that go into this, but if you run first of all, if you are running cold, you first start up in the morning and you're idling on a common rail, -4 degrees, and you turn off that pilot shot, it will shut the truck off.
Mm.
Like you need that pilot shot in there to get the main shot to happen. Now, if you were to bump your timing to 12 valve numbers where it's, 10, 15 degrees or 20 degrees of timing, yeah, it would sit there and it would run. It'd sound like a box of marbles and you think you had a 12 valve. But you need that pilot shot. When the truck gets
pilot
up to,
shot, just so people understand, is a very small injection event.
like 300 US approximately, so 300 millionths of a second versus your main shot that's like 1,000.
These both happen in the same cycle. As the piston's coming up, a little shot, piston comes up further, big
So like 14 degrees before top dead center, it'll do a quick 300 millionths of a second, 300 microseconds injection, just enough to put a couple mm's cubed of fuel in the cylinder. Then it waits 10 degrees or whatever the number is, and then it puts in another big shot. And because that small shot was able to burn and heat up the cylinder, it's getting that cylinder ready to burn that big shot. Like you're saying, that big shot, the core of the spray isn't actually burning, it's the outer bit. Well, if you can heat up the whole cylinder, that'll help the whole thing burn. And so, well, something you get into is if once the truck is warm and you put too much pilot in, now the cylinder is so hot, and I don't know if the flame front's still happening there or it's so hot, but it actually makes the truck smoky again. And if you get rid of the pilot, it makes it clean. And I think that's partially because of how the burn is happening. If you get that cylinder so hot and it's like the fuel is like burning as it enters, you're burning the fuel in that cone right there next to the injector. You're not utilizing the full air in the cylinder. And so that's just pilot whatever stuff. But like what you're talking about on 12 valve, where you have these itty bitty little fuel jets that are coming out, it's getting that fuel front going. That's exactly what I envision happening there. Because like pilot jets artificially increase your timing, which helps power greatly, and it makes it run cleaner. You're basically adding a small little pilot shot without the negative side effects of possibly putting in too much pilot if you had a common rail. It's pretty cool technology.
It really is. And you've been playing with a lot. Another question I have, timing specifically. Like I know when I first started tuning my common rail, I kind of went the mechanical route, and it smoked all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I towed, it just had a little haze because I was running too much timing. Now, my thought process would be like, well, if I put it in earlier, it has more time to burn. Why is it smoky? And if I have it later, less time to burn, it's not as smoky.
You're using like 12 valve logic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as common rail.
So I've done a bit of this because recently we went to a dyno event where I tried to spool GT55 fuel only, and I got to spool.
So in layman's terms, ginormous turbo, way bigger than would ever be ran.
Stock turbo is a 60 millimeter. If you're freaking big ballin', shot calling, you run like a 70 millimeter big single. And if you're really like about it, like competition going down the track, running 590s with a little spray, you're on an 80, 85 millimeter charger. This is a 98 millimeter charger. Because why not? But I just wanted to spool it, and I had the goal of just spooling it. Who knows what happened? Well, I got it to spool. I made a decent number. I know I have more in it. I know I can do better, but I kind of ran into some limits of what I was running. But with doing that, I had to figure out what timing, what pressure, what everything this thing wanted. And I thought I could go on there with my compound turbo logic and use that same fueling strategy to spool this big single, and it didn't work. Now, backstory. I can make about 30 pounds of boost, and that was it. That's all I'd make, about 600 horse, maybe 700 horse. Backstory, Todd with the Cummins cart will take that same exact turbo, spool it like it's nothing, and make 1,100 horse. John Strato with the 12 valve and
ancient technology,
just
P-pump 24 valve.
They're both P-pump 24 valves, but regardless, I'm a 24 valve. It's not like they have an advantage. I don't.
Valve too.
Yeah, and anyway, John Strato bolt that same turbo up, and make 1,400 horse and have zero issue spooling it. And I'm like, how the crap is my superior injection technology not spooling this darn turbo? And I got fed up with it after like a 10 different tune revisions or whatever it was, 15, 20, whatever tune revisions. I was like, okay, like maybe I need to throw 12 valve logic at this thing. So I dropped the fuel pressure like crazy. Like there's one cell in the tune file that says, okay, this is the maximum amount of pressure we can command. Normally I have that up into like around 200 or whatever, just for the,
and you're talking MPa megapascals.
Yep. So 32,000 PSI, whatever. Well, I was like, okay, this is the quick and easy way I can just like freaking drop these pressures to see what happens. So I dropped that down to, I don't remember what it was. It was like 100, so half.
Mhm.
And so it was like 16,000 psi, and
Which evidently is very close to P pump pressures.
I guessed. Okay, I don't know. And guess what? It spooled. It didn't make any power, but it spooled. And I was like, you know what? This is P pump life. But what
Did it smoke more and you dropped the pressure?
Smoke like a freaking train.
So to the untrained eye, though, had they seen you on the dyno before and after, they'd be like, this idiot doesn't know how to tune because look, his thing's smoking.
And I would agree with them. I don't, but I'm figuring it out.
But by you dropping the pressure and making the fuel burn differently, it had more burn going across the turbine wheel. And
it had more, like the atomization was worse. And so it was taking longer to burn, and that late fuel was putting heat into the turbine and spooling it. Now, one thing I didn't do was run a static 45 degrees of timing. And if I had done that, that would probably have fixed the low power issue. And so I would have like a kind of a dirty best of both worlds. And that's where I realized, like I've mentioned in the podcast a couple times before, that 12 valves piss me off when I'm trying to tune common rails, because I'm like, I have control of every single point of this ejection event, or not like as much as you can with an 849 ECM. And then 12 valve does basically the same thing. 95% is good, and sometimes better. Like, how the crap did a plunger, like caveman style injection event compete with the best I got? So, and made me realize that we're running, like, we just happen to have this combo of parts that works. And it's not really just so happens, it's because we've found all these different things that somehow work together. But in a 12 valve or a P pump engine, you're putting that fuel in extremely early because it takes so long to burn. And if that was a common rail, it wouldn't work because it wouldn't spool the charger. But because the atomization is so bad, it's burning some up front to get that power, and it's burning some out back to spool the charger. And as you make more heat and more power, more boost, more heat in the cylinder, that would inevitably make the burn faster and faster. So the more power you make, the faster that burn process is going to happen. So it's artificially increasing your timing as you start making more and more power. It's like, these bastards.
So it's like, as the turbo spools, there's more boost and heat in the motor, and it's just starts.
Like, I mean, how else did I make? I mean, I spooled it. I made, like, before I was stuck at 30 pounds, I made like 55 pounds of boost and like 600 horse because I was also at like 20 degrees, which I was like thinking about it. I'm like, that's probably what it would be at. Like at 4,700 RPM, if you're at 20 degrees, like, yeah, that'd probably be the outcome with a P pump 12 valve or a P pump 24 valve. Anyway, so what I ended up doing to get the thing to spool was I ended up running just like, I took the whole timing table and did a big fat 0 across the whole thing. And that didn't make it good power at all, but it did get it to spool to where I was finally able to then spike, bring up timing once it spooled. And what's funny is, if you watch the dyno, if you look at the graph, power is at 500-600 horse. For once it spools, it's at 500-600 horse. 55 pounds of boost on a GT55 spinning 4,500 RPM, 550-ish horsepower. Like, that's nothing. Then the moment I spike timing up, it goes to 1,100 horsepower, and then just plummets again, because once it gets timing in it, it doesn't have that heat energy to drive the turbo going. And so I'm capitalizing on this little Mount Everest. And by golly, that's how I have a trophy. Okay, so you can't hate on it too much.
So another reason why I think people are critical when they see a diesel smoking is when you see a gasoline engine smoking, they run poorly.
Yeah.
One time I was messing with the tune on one of my little LS vehicles, and I fat fingered the Lambda table, and I made it like 50% rich. Ooh. So like 0.59.
Nice.
And where I was adjusting it, the factory table doesn't run the same air fuel ratio throughout the RPM range. They go fattest right at peak torque, where there's the most engine load, around 4,000. And then up there on the top end, you lose power being that rich on a gas engine. They start pulling it back closer to about, 0.85 Lambda. Depends on the engine. Some like 0.86, but basically, they need to be like 0.8 at peak torque, so they don't detonate and it's safe. And if you go leaner at that, it doesn't really seem to add power. It just just knocks and pings and stuff. Well, I went too fat. And so as soon as I hit that cell as I was driving, I didn't know, because I just put the tune in. It was an accident. And as soon as I hit that, the truck, my Trailblazer, started visibly smoking out the tailpipe. And it was losing speed. And basically on that vehicle, when I went over 50% throttle, it went into power enrichment, which would reference that table. And so I could be at 49% throttle and it would be accelerating at 50 miles an hour, slowly going to 55 and 60. And as soon as I go to 50% throttle and do that, I had an air fuel ratio. I could see it go rich and there was black smoke coming out of my gas engine and it would lose power. It didn't have enough power to go. The speed limit was that rich. And so I think people associate that with a bad tune because any gas engine they've been in that they've smoked, or a nitrous engine, if the nitrous doesn't turn on, they do black smoke and they slow way down. Yeah, if you get that rich, it slows down. Diesels are the same thing though. If you get them way, way, way rich, they start losing power. But I mean, you're talking, it's like wet soot coming out to be at that kind of richness,
Yeah.
And so it's not like it's way different than gasoline or anything on the street. It's just the smoke threshold happens at a much leaner air fuel ratio, so lean that if a gas engine ran it, it would fail, it would burn, it would melt pistons. And so that's kind of really what it is. To get power, it's pretty universal that you've got to be about 20% rich. Why doesn't it make peak power?
Super lean with lots of nitrous.
But to make peak power, that same super lean nitrous engine would make more power if you put more fuel in there.
For sure.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be reliable. But on any engine combination, the max power happens about 20% rich. Why? Because that's when there's enough excess fuel to react with every molecule of air, every oxygen, every bit of oxygen in that cylinder can react with fuel.
Yeah, stoic is theoretical. 80% is in the real world.
Because you can't get every molecule of oxygen to react with every molecule of fuel unless there's a little bit of excess fuel, or about 20%. Now, I mean, don't quote me. There's some engines that are probably 15% is ideal and some are 25, but 20 is a good average on most things. And so diesel smoke, because that's where peak power happens, and smoke happens well before peak power.
Well, even on our testing here, like when we're like tuning our spool up on our trucks, we try to shoot for about 80% Lambda because it spools the charger the fastest. I mean, we have like no boost, right? And we're measuring AFR and we're tuning in 80% Lambda as it brings up because that's the fastest spool of the line. Like we've seen,
and we notice if we bring it back so it's clean, let's say Gale Bank's clean or whatever. I mean, Gale's fine. Any tuner looks at it and says, you're smoking, you're bad. If you let it smoke a little bit during spool up where you're making the least amount of power and you're trying to get that turbo going, it lights. You're right.
Yep. You find that time and time again. So anyway, it's definitely an interesting topic because diesel smoke is, everybody knows about it. It's the bane of a lot of people's existence. It makes sense in a competition vehicle. It really doesn't make a lot of sense on the street. We have enough technology now, especially in any kind of new vehicle. Whenever I see like a common rail or something, rolling coal around the town, I'm like, man, I mean, because you have said before, once on a common rail, once you reach the smoke threshold, you don't have as much to gain in a common rail as you do in a P-pump truck.
Yeah. If you didn't care about AFR, you didn't care about smoke, you can make 100% power. You can make 90-95% power completely clean
on a common rail. So extra little smoke
just going
to be
doesn't do it.
Yeah. So whatever reason, though, the tuning and the capacity of that combustion event in a common rail can be very clean. So yeah, if you have a truck out there that's modern, that's really just, especially if it's just from a like stock injector truck.
But it's around a similar Lambda value.
It's just clean.
It's just the common rail isn't as sooty the way it burns. So there's not as much soot that can make it out the tailpipe.
Yeah.
And so a 12 valve at, let's say 20-1, there can still be soot coming out of the tailpipe. In a common rail at 20-1, there's just that visible soot is not there because atomization's better.
So example for everyone, my Shory back in the day, my big tune 3, whatever it was, made 1,300 horse, and it was a little bit smoky. I would daily it in the 1,200 horse tune because it was squeaky clean.
Yeah,
it was awesome. But 13 is all it had. 1,200 was squeaky clean. 1,300, all you get out of it.
And then my truck, let's say at 1,300, if we had that at 1,300, my race truck, it'd probably be squeaky clean around 700 or 800 horsepower and full power, a lot of smoke to get to 1,300, but that's a, different injection system. And it's just because that soot isn't necessarily just unburnt fuel. It's partially combusted fuel that connects together and sticks, and then it kind of almost like a creosoted log. There could still be good wood in the middle of a burnt tree that's all charcoaled on the outside, but it's kind of protected from the air and the heat, insulated by that layer of soot. And so that's why you can have visible stuff going out that, that isn't really, So a lot of oxygen can still be reacted anyways. So AFR or stoics or your lambda gauge can be, it's not 100% equal to the visible smoke output when you have different injection systems there. But
basically what I've taken away from this is that performance diesels are good for the environment and performance gas engines are not.
There's one takeaway.
That's it. But anyway, that's kind of about burned up our time. Do you have any other final thoughts on, we kind of went swirl, injection, timing, fuel density, fuel things like it's interesting.
I mean, one just quick thing. How do you get rid of smoke so that you don't have to tune on the rich side? Excess oxygen. So anything to get more air in the cylinders boost. Swirl really helps that mixing action. So like a ported cylinder head. Your tuning is big. So if it's a common rail, the tuning. Other things, compression ratio really helps. So if there's a way to bump up your compression ratio, even on a modern engine, the smoke threshold is easier to avoid that smoke, but that's pretty much it. Tune not for max power, tune for max cleanliness.
Good engine components, good injection components, and you'll be good to go.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. It's interesting for me. We've been talking about this behind the scenes for quite a long time, especially since we put an AFR gauge, Lambda gauge on our dyno. We've really been having a lot of fun with that. So, you guys enjoy this, and we'll see you next time on the Power Gym podcast.